I'd been walking for hours. It was the middle of October, and I had a few days off work. I'd been feeling cooped up and overwhelmed lately, and the idea of getting lost in the woods for a bit sounded better than any therapy or conversation. I drove out to a state forest I'd only been to once before, a place mostly forgotten, with long dirt roads, unmarked trails, and barely any visitors once the summer season ended. It was the kind of place where you could walk all day and not see another person. The morning started fine. I parked my truck near a pull-off where the gravel road thinned out, and I loaded my backpack, water, snacks, flashlight, first aid kit, knife, and extra layer, just the usual. I didn't plan to camp, just hike deep into the woods and turn around by early evening. The air was crisp, and the light had that dry, pale quality it gets in the fall. The trees were thinning out their leaves, orange and brown litter covering the ground, the kind that muffles your steps and makes everything sound quieter than it really is. I didn't follow any marked trail, just a series of old logging paths that crisscrossed the area. Some of them were overgrown, others wide and obvious, but there were no trail signs, no mileage posts. You had to pay attention or mark your way if you didn't want to get turned around. I didn't mark anything. I figured I'd just remember. Around midday, I stopped at a small clearing to eat. I sat on a fallen log, eating a granola bar and sipping from my bottle, and just listened. There was the wind, pushing through the trees in bursts, the way it does in autumn. Every now and then, I heard a distant crack, branches snapping, maybe something walking. It's always hard to tell out there. You hear things, but you never really know what made the sound. Most likely deer, maybe a bear, but they weren't too common in that area. Either way, I was used to being alone in the woods. I've done it since I was a kid. After resting for a bit, I decided to press further. I wasn't paying too much attention to where I was going, just wandering deeper. I wanted to find a stream I remembered from years ago, with a little footbridge someone had made out of planks and rope. I had a memory of standing on it, watching the water, and I thought I might try to find it again. But I didn't find the stream. Instead, I kept walking until I realized I hadn't seen anything familiar for a while. The light had shifted too. That golden afternoon glow had started turning gray. The wind picked up again, stronger now, with a chill behind it that reminded me night wasn't far off. I stopped and checked my phone. No service, not even a bar. I wasn't surprised, but it still gave me a small knot in my stomach. I turned back the way I thought I'd come. I figured if I retraced my steps for an hour or so, I'd hit one of the larger logging roads and follow that back to my truck. But as I walked, things didn't line up the way they should have. I didn't pass the same logs I stepped over earlier, didn't see the twisted oak I remembered passing before lunch. Everything started to look the same: brown leaves, tree trunks, the occasional stump. The woods don't change much in autumn, and it's easy to lose your bearings if you're not careful. I walked faster, heart thumping a little harder, trying not to let panic in. I told myself I'd find a familiar marker soon, maybe an old trail post or some trash left behind by other hikers. But nothing came, just more woods. Then I heard something, a low, rhythmic tapping. First, I thought it was woodpeckers, but it didn't sound like that. It was too steady. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped walking and stood still. The tapping stopped. I held my breath. Wind moved through the trees again, rustling leaves, but nothing else. I started walking again. The tapping came back. I stopped too. I spun around, scanning the trees behind me, then to the sides. Nothing, just trees and dying brush. I moved forward again, slower this time, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. It was still behind me, keeping pace. I stopped suddenly, hoping to catch it off guard. Nothing, dead quiet. My throat was dry, and I realized I hadn't sipped water in a while. I took a long drink, keeping my eyes moving. Whatever it was, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know. Part of me knew it was just an animal, maybe something with an uneven step. A deer with a limp. That's what I told myself. I kept walking, ignoring the tapping, but never fully shaking it. I heard it now and then, just faint enough that I could pretend it wasn't there if I wanted to. Then the sun started to drop below the trees. The woods got dark fast, and I realized I had no idea where I was. I had no signal, no map, and no clear trail to follow. I could keep moving or set up a quick camp and wait for morning. I had no tent, just an emergency tarp, but I'd slept in worse situations. I decided to push forward. I didn't want to stop moving, not with that sound following me. I picked a direction and walked, hoping I'd run into something. A fire ring, a trail marker, anything. What I found instead was a fence. It was old and rusted, a barbed wire setup that ran in both directions as far as I could see. Not the kind for livestock. This was tall, with thick posts, and it looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. But it was deliberate. Somebody put it there to keep something out, or in. I followed it for a while, hoping it would lead somewhere, maybe to a road or building. The tapping was gone now, or maybe I just stopped hearing it. My boots scuffed leaves with every step. I started noticing bones near the fence. Animal bones, small at first, then bigger. A deer spine, a cracked skull. Some looked fresh. Others were just dry fragments. Then I smelled it. Rot. Not the kind of decay you get from leaves or mud. This was thick and sour and caught in my throat like spoiled meat. I almost turned back, but I kept going. I saw the structure just as the last light died behind the trees. A shack or shed, small and gray, maybe 8 feet tall, hidden just inside the fence line, camouflaged by brush and darkness. It didn't look lived in, but there was something off about it. I don't know how to explain it. It just didn't belong. I approached slowly. The door was slightly open, and the smell was worse here. My skin prickled. I didn't want to go inside, but it was either that or spend the night in open woods with something possibly following me. I pushed the door open with the end of my flashlight. The inside was empty at first glance. Just dirt floor, rotting walls, and a pile of what looked like old burlap sacks in the corner. I stepped in and shined my light around. That's when I saw the hooks. 5 large meat hooks hung from the ceiling, rusted but intact. Underneath one was a dark stain on the ground, soaked deep into the dirt. I backed out without looking closer. I circled the shack, trying to figure out what the hell it was used for. I found a trail behind it, narrow and overgrown, but it looked like it had seen recent use. The grass was flattened. I had no better options, so I followed it. The trail led deeper for maybe a mile, then ended at what looked like an old dump site. Rusted out barrels, pieces of machinery, torn tarps tangled in vines. And something else, an old camper trailer, its door hanging open. I went closer, curiosity beating out caution for a moment. Inside, it was gutted. The furniture had been ripped out. Walls were scratched, gouged with what looked like claw marks. I stepped in carefully, shining my light along the floor. There was a bag in the corner, a backpack, newer than everything else. I checked it, clothes, a flashlight, some energy bars, a phone with a dead battery. Nothing that told me whose it was. I backed out again. I didn't want to know who had been there last. I followed the dump site around to the other side and finally saw what I'd been hoping to see. An old fire road. It was rough and rocky, but it was wide, and I knew if I followed it long enough, I'd end up somewhere. A gate, a parking area, anything. I walked fast. My legs were tired, and my back ached, but I didn't stop. The tapping had come back. It was farther now, maybe, fainter, but still there. An hour passed, maybe 2. My flashlight started to dim. I had a backup, but I didn't want to stop moving long enough to switch it out. Then I saw a sign. Metal, bent but still standing. It had the state forest's name on it and a faded arrow pointing left. I followed it, heart pounding. After 10 more minutes, I saw the shimmer of my truck's windshield through the trees. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just walked to my truck, unlocked the door, and climbed in. I locked the doors and sat there for a minute, breathing. Before I started the engine, I looked back toward the woods. I didn't see anything, but I heard one last faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. Then nothing. I drove home that night and didn't stop once. The next day, I reported what I found to the local ranger office. They sent someone out to investigate, but I never heard back. I tried to forget about it, to tell myself it was just old hunting gear, abandoned junk, animal noises. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, and it wasn't meant to be found. The cabin was as remote as they come. I'd found it years ago while hunting deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road or trail. It was an old single-room wooden structure with a rusty tin roof, a stone fireplace, and one small window that looked out over a clearing. I'd spent plenty of nights there before, always alone, and never felt truly scared. This time, though, something felt different. The day had been long. I'd packed in just enough supplies: canned beans, some jerky, water from a nearby stream, and my rifle, of course. I'd planned to hunt some deer, but didn't see much except a few rabbits and some tracks that looked old. The woods had a quiet hush to them, the kind that settles before a storm, though the sky had stayed clear all day. I chopped some firewood, fixed myself a simple dinner, and settled in early. The cabin was cold, the wood creaking as the night fell, but I'd brought enough blankets. I woke just after midnight, the cold air prickling my skin. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it clearly. A low, guttural howl, slow and deep, carried through the trees not far from the cabin. It was nothing like the usual wolf or coyote sounds. Those animals make quick, sharp yips or high-pitched howls. This was heavier, slower, almost like a person with a bad cough trying to howl. The sound shook the silence around me. I froze in bed, clutching my rifle tightly. My heart thudded hard, but I told myself to stay calm. I've hunted enough to know the woods hold all kinds of sounds, and sometimes your mind plays tricks when you're alone at night. Still, that howl was too close. I could hear it echo through the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing, as if something was moving slowly through the mud and brush. The howling didn't stop. It came again, then again, each time lasting longer and ending in a slow, dragging breath. I stayed still in the dark, eyes wide open, straining to see anything outside the small window. My rifle was close, resting against the wall beside me. The fire in the stone fireplace had burned low, but the faint light from the dying embers cast shadows that flickered against the walls. Outside, the woods were pitch black, trees standing like silent sentinels. Every now and then, a dry branch snapped far off in the distance. The sound kept coming intermittently, never moving closer, but never getting farther either. It was like something was circling the cabin, taking its time. The noise was too deliberate, too heavy to be any wild animal I'd ever heard. Wolves and coyotes don't make slow, guttural noises like that. This was different, something big. I stayed awake, my fingers tightening around the rifle's cold metal stock, waiting for dawn. Hours passed, each howl breaking the stillness. My nerves stretched tight. My eyes burned from staring into the dark, trying to catch any sign of movement. Finally, as the eastern sky lightened with the first gray of morning, the howling stopped. I crept to the door, rifle raised, and stepped outside. The air was cold but fresh. The woods were quiet again, normal in their early morning calm. I scanned the muddy ground around the cabin. The previous days of rain had left everything soft, perfect for tracking. But there were no paw prints or claw marks that I could find. No sign of any animal at all. Instead, there were huge, deep indentations in the mud, like the marks left by something heavy, something far larger than any bear or deer. The holes were deep enough that I could sink my hand into them. They circled the cabin in uneven patterns, as if whatever made them had been moving slowly, carefully, pacing back and forth. The ground was churned up badly, and some of the prints looked almost like they had been pressed with the sole of a large boot, except I'd never heard any footsteps during the night. I checked my rifle again, relieved it was still loaded and ready. My fingers were numb from the cold, but my mind raced. I thought of every animal I'd ever encountered in the woods: bears, mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, and none left tracks like these or made sounds like that. I looked around the clearing, trying to spot any other clues. No broken branches, no disturbed bushes. The trees stood tall and untouched, and the underbrush was as thick as ever. Nothing had been torn up or scratched. That's when I realized something else. No scat, no droppings, no signs of an animal feeding or even resting nearby. Just those massive indentations in the mud. I went back inside the cabin and packed up quickly. I wasn't about to stay another night. The forest had its secrets, and sometimes it doesn't want to show them. I took one last look out the window before I left. The woods were quiet again, but I could still feel that heavy presence lingering. On the hike back to my truck, I stayed alert, listening for any sounds behind me. I kept my rifle ready, eyes darting between the trees, but I didn't hear that howl again. The tracks stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, fading into the forest floor like whatever made them had vanished without a trace. I've been back to that area a few times since, always during the day, and I never saw those prints or heard that howl again. I don't know what made them, but whatever it was big, slow, and deliberate. It stayed close enough to watch, but far enough away to avoid being seen. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the woods, I still hear that low, guttural howl echo in my mind, and I don't think I'll ever want to spend a night alone in that cabin again. The day started like any other when we reached the campsite deep in the woods. It was the kind of place you find on the edges of a national forest, where the trees stand tall and thick, blocking out much of the sky. We had driven a narrow dirt road, bouncing over roots and stones, before finally pulling up to a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and oaks. My wife, our 2 kids, Ella, who was 7, and Max, who just turned 4, and I unloaded the car, eager to set up camp for the weekend. The air was cool, crisp with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The forest around us was silent except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. We picked a spot for the tent near a natural fire pit, an old circle of stones blackened by years of use. The ground was soft, covered with a thick layer of dry leaves and twigs. We worked together to pitch the tent. Max was excited to help, but mostly he just wanted to run around and explore. Ella carefully arranged the sleeping bags inside while I collected firewood. The wood was dry, lying scattered in small piles around the clearing, perfect for a campfire. I made sure to find pieces that would burn easily, thin branches, dry sticks, and some larger logs to keep the fire going. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, we built the fire. I arranged the wood in a teepee shape inside the stone circle and lit a small bundle of dry twigs. Smoke curled up into the evening air as the flames caught. The fire crackled and popped, casting warm orange light over our faces and making the shadows dance along the trees. We sat close together, roasting marshmallows and telling silly stories. But after a few minutes, something strange happened. The fire started to die much faster than I expected. The flames flickered and shrank, and the heat almost disappeared. I poked the fire, shifting the logs, trying to let air in. I added more dry wood, expecting it to roar back to life, but it didn't. The flames sputtered and went down to weak embers again. I tried lighting the twigs once more. Still, the fire refused to grow. I glanced around. The wood was dry, no dampness that I could see or smell. The wind was light, barely enough to disturb the smoke. Nothing seemed wrong with the conditions. My wife tried to help, blowing gently at the embers while I gathered more kindling. We tried several times to restart the fire, but each time, the flames would burst up only briefly before fading out. The kids were getting cold. Ella pulled her jacket tighter, and Max started shivering. We wrapped them in blankets and sat close to the tiny heat that remained. I kept poking the fire, frustrated. Eventually, we gave up and moved inside the tent earlier than planned. The night was quiet at first, the only sound the occasional snap of twigs under small animals moving nearby. But then, about an hour after we turned in, I noticed something odd. Soft whispers floated through the air, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It wasn't like normal forest noises. No animal calls, no wind in the trees, just faint, hushed voices that seemed to come from the shadows of the woods around us. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a trick of my ears. My wife heard it too. We looked at each other but said nothing, not wanting to scare the kids. Then Ella, from inside the tent, whispered that she saw something, a dark figure standing just beyond the firelight, near the edge of the trees. We all looked, but we saw nothing. The fire was barely glowing, casting weak light that didn't reach far into the forest. The shadows were thick and still. I told Ella to stay inside, and Max clung tightly to my wife's side. The whispers came again, soft and low, almost like breathing. No words, no clear language, just the sound of many voices mingled together, coming from the dark woods surrounding us. It was impossible to tell if it was close or far, moving or still. It didn't sound angry or happy, just quiet and strange. We didn't speak much after that. The kids were too scared to sleep, and I stayed awake, listening for any change. I thought maybe someone was nearby, another camper or a hunter, but it didn't feel right. The whispers didn't sound human. They didn't sound natural. By morning, the fire pit was cold and empty. The wood we had collected lay untouched except for the bits we tried to burn the night before. The forest around us looked normal in the daylight, but none of us felt right. We packed up quickly, not wanting to stay another minute in that place. The kids didn't complain. They just wanted to leave. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the thinning trees. I wanted to say it was just our imagination, that maybe we were tired or too jumpy. But something about that night felt real, like a warning. The woods had held their silence during the day, but at night, something watched and whispered from the shadows. Something that didn't want us there. We didn't return to that campsite. Every time I think about it, I feel the cold from that failing fire and hear the soft voices in the dark. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales. It was something else. Something quiet, patient, and waiting just beyond the firelight. The forest was deep, dark, and vast. My friend had been hiking for hours, miles away from any road or cell signal, deep in a national forest that few people ventured into. He was an experienced hiker, someone who had camped and traveled through wild places many times before, so he wasn't worried about being out there alone. He knew the risks. He was prepared. But this night was different. He set up camp just as the sun was dipping below the thick trees. The light faded fast, and the forest turned that heavy, dark green-black shade that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. The first thing he noticed, even before the sun disappeared completely, was the silence. Usually, at this time of day, there would be birds calling to each other, insects buzzing or chirping, maybe some small animals rustling through the leaves. But here it was unnaturally quiet. Not even the slightest hint of a bird's song or the soft hum of bugs. The kind of silence that felt like the forest was holding its breath. He shrugged it off, figuring maybe it was just a quiet patch. He'd heard that before, but as he sat down to start a fire, the silence didn't break. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. Just silence pressing in on him from all sides. He carefully laid out some dry wood and started a small fire, the flames flickering weakly in the still air. The fire gave off a bit of warmth, but more importantly, it gave off light. He sat close, poking at the flames with a stick, listening to the crackle of burning wood. That was the only sound in the whole forest. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He looked around, scanning the dense trees that surrounded his small clearing. Shadows twisted and stretched under the firelight. Every now and then, the wind rustled a few leaves, but nothing moved close. No eyes shined back at him. No figures emerged from the dark. Still, he could feel it, the sense of eyes on him from just beyond the reach of his fire. Hours passed. The fire died down to glowing embers. He was careful to keep it small, knowing how easy it is to start a wildfire. The forest around him stayed silent, dead silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then he heard it, faint footsteps. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature passing nearby. But the footsteps didn't sound right. They were slow, deliberate, circling around his camp. No voices, no sounds of breath or movement in the bushes, just footsteps. Bare, soft thuds on the forest floor. They moved slowly, always around him, never getting closer, never moving away. His heart started to race, but he didn't panic. Instead, he stayed still, listening carefully. The footsteps made a quiet, steady circle around the tent. He thought about shouting, but no voice would carry far in this deep forest. And what good would that do if no one was around? He grabbed a flashlight, clicked it on, and shone the beam around the camp, but he saw nothing. No people, no animals, only empty trees and the dark shadows between them. The footsteps continued for a while longer, then slowly faded into the distance, swallowed by the stillness. He stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every little noise made him jump. Every rustle set his nerves on edge. The fire finally died out completely. The cold crept in, but he kept the flashlight close, ready to shine it out if anything moved. Morning came slow and gray. The sky was overcast, filtering a dull, weak light through the thick branches. He packed up his gear quickly, but before leaving, he decided to check around his camp to see if there were any signs of what had made those footsteps. That's when he found them. Footprints. They were around the perimeter of his tent, stepping in a rough circle, matching the pattern of the footsteps he'd heard last night. The prints were barefoot with 5 toes visible, but they were huge, way too big for any animal he knew of nearby. Not a bear, not a large dog, nothing familiar. They looked human, but no one else was supposed to be out here, and the prints were far too large for any regular person. Maybe a giant? The prints were fresh, the dirt still soft enough to hold the shape perfectly. They weren't deep, so the person or creature wasn't heavy, but they left no other signs. No broken branches, no displaced leaves, nothing else disturbed except these footprints. He felt a chill run down his spine. Whoever or whatever had been circling him in the night wasn't like any animal. It had walked silently, watching him, waiting. The silence, the footsteps, the prints, all pointed to something out there in the forest, close by, but unseen. He didn't wait to find out more. He packed up the rest of his gear, double-checked everything, and started hiking back toward the nearest trailhead. His heart was still pounding, and his eyes kept darting to the trees. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was magnified. He didn't look back once. When he finally got out of the dense forest and back to a place with phone signal, he called me immediately. He told me everything. The silence, the footsteps, the footprints. I listened carefully, knowing how serious he was. He was shaken, not just by fear, but by how real it all felt. This wasn't a story to scare people around a campfire. This was something he experienced. He never went back, not even once. Sometimes, when he's home and we talk about his trip, he still looks at me with that same uneasy feeling in his eyes, like whatever was watching him out there in the woods is still somewhere close, waiting. And for him, that's enough reason never to step foot in those woods again. The day we arrived at the mountain town was clear and warm, the kind of late summer afternoon that makes you feel like the forest around you is alive and breathing. The town itself was small, with just a few buildings clustered near the highway, but the real draw was the trail that led deep into the woods behind it. It was a popular spot, known for beautiful views and rugged terrain that tested even experienced hikers. We had planned the camping trip for months, a weekend getaway for our tight group of friends to escape the noise of the city and get back to nature. There were 5 of us, me, Sarah, Mark, Jenna, and Luis. Sarah was the most experienced hiker among us. She'd spent years exploring trails across the country, always careful, always prepared. She had a steady calm about her, the kind that made you feel safe in the wild. When we arrived at the campsite, near the base of the mountain trail, she was already talking about going for a hike the next day. The rest of us weren't as eager. We were there to relax by the campfire, drink coffee in the morning, and just enjoy the woods. But Sarah was restless. Early the next morning, just after breakfast, she said she wanted to do a solo hike. The trailhead was right behind our campsite, marked by a wooden sign and a narrow dirt path leading upward. We all thought it was a good idea. She'd be back by afternoon, she promised. She packed a small day pack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and her map. Her boots were laced tight, and her hat shaded her face from the sun that was already growing warm. We watched her walk off, the crunch of her boots on dry leaves fading quickly into the quiet woods. The forest was thick, tall pines and firs shading the ground in patches, with wildflowers and small bushes scattered along the trail. The air smelled fresh, filled with pine and damp earth. Birds sang in the trees, and a light breeze whispered through the branches. Hours passed. We stayed at the campsite, waiting and joking around. But when the afternoon shadows grew long and Sarah still hadn't returned, a feeling of unease settled over us. Mark suggested we go look for her. We grabbed flashlights and called out her name as we followed the trail up the mountain. But the woods swallowed our voices. No answer came back. We split up, searching along the narrow dirt path and nearby clearings. The forest felt different in the late afternoon, less friendly. The sounds of birds quieted, replaced by rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Then, near a small creek that crossed the trail, Jenna stopped suddenly. "Look at this," she said quietly. There, in the soft mud by the water's edge, were Sarah's footprints, clear and distinct. But then they stopped, just ended right at the creek bank. No sign she had crossed or continued on the other side. We gathered together, stunned. How could her footprints just stop? We searched along the creek's edge, calling her name again and again. No sign of her anywhere, no broken branches, no dropped gear, nothing. That night, we returned to the town and found the forest ranger's office. The ranger was a man in his 50s, weathered from years outdoors but with a calm, steady manner. He listened to our story carefully, nodding. "It's not unusual," he said, "for people to get disoriented out here. The woods can be tricky, especially near water. The trail crosses the creek at a shallow point, but it's easy to lose your bearings if you stray from it." We told him about Sarah, how careful and experienced she was. The ranger looked thoughtful. "Even experienced hikers can get turned around," he said. "Sometimes it's simple things. Shadows, uneven terrain, even how your mind plays tricks when you're tired. But we'll start a search in the morning." We spent the night in restless anxiety. None of us could sleep. The forest around us was dark and silent, the shadows seeming to stretch closer with every hour. I kept thinking about Sarah, alone somewhere out there, and the way her footprints had just stopped. Morning came with heavy fog clinging to the trees. The ranger and a small team of volunteers joined us at the campsite. They brought dogs and radios and plans to grid search the area. We followed the path again, but the woods seemed less inviting in the pale morning light. Every snapped twig and distant bird call made my heart jump. We searched all day, following every hint and lead. We found nothing. No footprints beyond that creek. No gear, no trace of Sarah. Then, late in the afternoon, one of the searchers called out from a thicket a few hundred yards down the trail. They had found Sarah's backpack, resting on a fallen log just off the path. The pack was zipped shut, her water bottle inside, along with a small notebook and some snacks. Everything looked untouched, as if she had set it down and walked away. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. The ranger took the pack carefully and examined it. There was no sign of struggle, no damage, no blood. Just the quiet, strange stillness of a place that felt off. Days passed. We reported her missing to the police. Helicopters flew over the mountain, dogs tracked the woods, and volunteers combed every inch they could reach. But Sarah was gone. People in town said stories about the trail, hikers who disappeared before, hikers who got lost and never found. But no one had a clear explanation. No bodies, no clues. The forest was wide and deep, with endless patches of thick underbrush and rocky ledges. The creek where Sarah's footprints ended was small, shallow, and slow-moving. It didn't look like a place that could hide much, but it did. The only thing that made sense was that something had happened to her out there. Something natural, something that didn't leave a mark or a trail. Maybe she slipped and fell into a hidden crevice or a deep pool under the water. Maybe she wandered off the trail, caught in a dense patch of thorns or thick bushes, and couldn't call for help. Maybe she was hurt and crawled away, hiding from us. Whatever it was, the mountain kept its secret. The weeks after, the rest of us tried to return to normal life. But the memory of that trip haunted me. The way the woods had felt so calm and alive the morning Sarah left, and so silent and empty after she vanished. I still think about her footprints stopping by that creek. about how she didn't try to cross, didn't come back, about the way the forest ranger said people get disoriented, even when they know the woods well. The truth is, sometimes the wild doesn't give you a story to tell. Sometimes it just takes someone and keeps them, and you never know why. Sarah's name is still on the missing list. Her family holds on to hope, but deep down, I think we all know she's gone forever, lost to the woods that don't forgive mistakes or mercy. And that's the scariest part.